Contrary to what basically everyone says, the dollar's demise is not political, and it can't, by definition, crash. Now, the exchange value may fluctuate, but those fluctuations are determined by the needs of the reserve currency. In fact, commentary on the dollar is wildly misleading because hardly anyone, basically no one, understands what a reserve currency even is, let alone what it is supposed to do. And once you understand that and understand what all of this means, your view on it doesn't just change, it never comes back. This is like Plato's allegory of the cave. No more trying to decipher shadows on the wall like everyone else. Here we're going to get into the full light of truth using facts and evidence. And that goes for foreigners selling treasuries too, which is all a part of reserve currency operations and management of conditions. Countries have been selling treasury bills for as far back as the Eurodollar has been around, but knowing that doesn't fit with all these narratives and agendas economics has let loose by being such a poor discipline for the study of actual economy. So here in our latest Make It Make Sense video, we're going to lift the veil behind the reserve currency, starting with what it actually is, and it isn't what you think. Nope. The dollar isn't really the reserve currency and hasn't been since maybe the middle 50s, if not earlier. The world runs on Eurodollars, not dollars, and there is a world of difference between those two things. So we'll cover what it is that a reserve currency has to do in order to be a reserve currency. Has to do in order to be one. It's not really about the exchange value either. That just tells us something about how the Eurodollar is doing at what it needs to be doing. There are so many mainstream misconceptions that it's understandable everyone is confused on the topic. Mainstream economics has little use for international money or anything international. Economists speak about national economies as if they're totally separate entities rather than highly integrated, stitched together by this Eurodollar. The truth is, because of that limited and let's call it wrong worldview, economics doesn't understand reserve currency either, so it's quite natural that hardly anyone else does. So let's fill in the gaps here with Eurodollar University's Make It Make Sense by going through reserve currencies, starting with foreign governments selling treasuries and how that fits into all of this stuff. Because reserve currency is one of the most important topics in all of small e economics, and the operation of that reserve currency, there's nothing that it doesn't touch in your daily life. So let's go back to the early 1960s, right? 1963 to be precise. There's some stuff going on in the Eurodollar world, some tightness in it owing to problems in Italy that we don't need to get into here, flows of lira into and out of Switzerland, all using the Eurodollar as a vehicle currency. That's a concept they're going to keep coming back to time and time again. In December 1963, in part because of all this stuff going on in Europe, that's the other thing, this is global, Japanese banks were having a hard time securing dollar funding in this Eurodollar system, encountering higher costs, maybe even more collateral demands. I don't really know because the details are scant. But what we do know is that in response to this Eurodollar tightness and problems, the Japanese government sold quite a lot of treasury bills to fill in that gap. In fact, the FOMC's December 1963 Memorandum of Discussion contains the following statement. It was reflected, however, in transactions in the New York money market. The Japanese government, for instance, was selling U.S. Treasury bills to provide funds for Japanese commercial banks to repay Eurodollar loans they were unable to renew. Were they ditching the dollar in 1963? Did they hate LBJ? Were they rejecting the lone gunman theory in Dallas just a month before? None of the above. They were responding to dollar tightness by selling reserve assets to help out their local banks. On the contrary, the Japanese were enthusiastic early adopters of this Eurodollar form of money. It allowed Japan to transform from a shattered World War II defeated society into eventually the world's second largest economy and the envy of everyone everywhere. No one was going to accept the yen, and they couldn't themselves accept every different form of currency on the planet. They needed a single currency that was available and acceptable in every place around the world. That's what the Eurodollar was, and that's the roles that it needed to fill as a true reserve currency. So what is a reserve currency, and how does it lead to Japanese selling treasury bills? Where do these treasury bills come from? Where does all of this money come from? Well, to start with, a reserve currency is an intermediating currency. In some ways, the term is misleading. An intermediating currency means it needs to allow very different systems to talk to each other in a single common medium or language or standards, as it turns out. Let's do a simple example. The example I always use is, some export firm in Sweden wants to sell some of its local furniture, maybe it's IKEA, to somebody. Let's use Japan, the Japanese example. So the Japanese want to buy some furniture from Sweden, or they want to have some furniture made in Sweden available to sell in Japan. In order to make that happen, though, the Japanese would have to have kroner available to pay for these Swedish goods. Or the other side of that, maybe the Swedish exporter would have to be willing to accept yen for payment. But hardly anyone in Tokyo is going to have a steady supply of kroner to be able to send all the way to Sweden. And no one in Sweden is going to be able to use yen for anything either local or in close proximity to the country. Now, they could still do a trade, but it will be difficult, it'll be cumbersome, and it will be costly. However, if there is a single currency that is available in Japan in steady supply, while also being acceptable and useful in Sweden, that common intermediary currency makes global trade across vast distances and among greatly different systems not only possible, it can be relatively seamless and highly efficient. This is the secret to the highly globalized world and the unparalleled prosperity it unlocked in the latter half of the 20th century and for a time in the first part of the 21st century. All because of this one intermediating vehicle currency. That was the Eurodollar. It stood between various different systems and allowed them to communicate with each other, transact with one another all over the world. Now, the term reserve currency, as I said, is somewhat misleading. It's called the reserve currency because in its earlier forms, mainly the British pound, banks all over the British Empire had to hold reserves, little physical reserves, to make sure the English currency came to be widely accessible when it was necessary. Trade and even regular economy wouldn't be delayed or constrained by a lack of single common medium, meaning this useful medium of exchange. But unlike old systems like the British currency system, there is no physical currency in the Eurodollar format. These are all balances on a ledger. And we'll get to the ledger money part of it in just a second. As the system became more successful, more of these ledger dollars that were flowing around the world would accumulate in export nations, such as oil exporters, at least after 1973 and the oil shock. You see, there is no petrodollar. That's a specific example of the Eurodollar, and we'll get to the petrodollar myth in a future episode to make it make sense. But what you have to know here, the role of Eurodollar banks in all of this, what they actually do, and what the reserve currency really does need to do, or what people call the Eurodollar market, it's really the Eurodollar system run by global banks that recirculate these ledger dollars from where they accumulate to where they can be better used at other places around the world. That's what's so powerful about the Eurodollar system. Basically being able to move money from wherever it is to wherever it really needs to be seamlessly and efficiently as possible. And it uses things like wholesale markets, used to be Eurodollar deposit once upon a time, or repo, and nowadays FX derivatives. But it's all about keeping money mobile. That's the key here. In order to be useful in Japan as well as in Sweden, and available in Japan as well as in Sweden, money has to be able to move from A to B, going through X, Y, and Z along the way. But from its very early days, it wasn't just about moving ledger dollars for global trade and merchandise. What people call capital flows, it's basically the same thing as before, only here, instead of, say, Japanese using their access to dollars to buy goods from Sweden, as we did in the earlier example, they can simply use those dollars to invest in US dollar assets or take these ledger dollars and then relend them to other places in the world, becoming another engine, another critical engine of circulation and redistribution of ledger money into other places around the planet. This is the same principle as what's behind the carry trade. And all because of the reach and availability, meaning flow and recirculation of this ledger money. And this goes back to the early days of the Eurodollar system too. As the BIS noted in 1964, Some lending of euro currencies has clearly had nothing to do with international trade. For instance, some U.S. securities dealers and brokers have been borrowing in the Eurodollar market instead of from banks in New York. Incidentally, European branches of U.S. banks have recently been shifting less of their Eurodollar deposits back to the head office than a few years ago, and have been lending more to local borrowers, particularly foreign branches and affiliates of U.S. firms. What they're really saying there is that you have brokers and dealers, banks, all of the inside the United States, outside the United States, all of them working together, integrating their various ledgers, all for the common purpose of moving money from wherever it was to wherever it could be used most efficiently, in theory. I keep talking about ledger money because we're not talking about actual physical dollars. And this is one of the key distinctions between saying the reserve currency is a dollar and realizing the reserve currency is actually Eurodollar. As Milton Friedman wrote in 1969, that got republished a couple years later, what he reported in 1969 for the Eurodollar was, deposit obligations are typically discharged by providing a credit or deposit at another bank, as when you draw a check on your bank, which the recipient deposits, quote unquote, in his. For Eurodollar banks, the amount of literal cash they hold is negligible. There's no physical cash here. These are all bank ledger entries. So you have a bank in Switzerland that has a dollar credit, for example, meaning a dollar deposit, at a bank in London. The bank in Switzerland can transfer that dollar credit to someone else's payment, say to a bank in France. Now the bank in France has a dollar credit at the same bank in London, even though no physical dollars actually moved anywhere. But yet the net result is as if there was physical money transferred from the bank in Switzerland to the one in France. It's all just ledgers. And where the Eurodollar really took off was being able to integrate all of these transactions and all of these dollar claims, these Eurodollars, and then make them useful all across the world. Because in the ledger money format, they're incredibly efficient. It's really about managing and maintaining and monitoring messages. That's really what the Eurodollar system is. It's not really a currency system as you might imagine, so much as a telecommunications network. And as a telecommunications network, it was very easy, relatively speaking, to plug in all these different places around the world, because all you really had to do was get into the system. And once you were connected, you were participating in this global intermediating medium. It's interbank relationships. As Robert Russo pointed out in 1984, saying, the enormous expansion in markets for US dollars offshore and the new networks of interbank relations that made possible the creation of additional supplies of dollars outside the United States and beyond the control of the Federal Reserve. It's the literal interpretation of what Robert Russo said. These were new networks of interbank relations whose goal was and whose end result was creating Eurodollars, these claims on dollars outside the United States that became its entirely separate currency system that had no role for the Federal Reserve, which is exactly what I talked about in our last Make It Make Sense video on why the Federal Reserve was left to target an interest rate. This is why, because the reserve currency moved into a ledger money format, mainly outside the United States, and therefore really had no place for the Fed. The whole point, as I'm going to keep reinforcing here, is to be able to move money without moving any actual money. Keeping track of all these dollar claims, these Eurodollars, and making them useful in all of these various settings, in the real economy, merchandise trade, as well as in financial economy that aren't really capital flows so much as the exchange of these ledger money transactions. They become available to anyone who has access to the system, which is theoretically everyone. So what the Eurodollar system does and what the Eurodollar banks do is integrate all of these millions of ledgers from all around the world. And as you can imagine, I hope, it requires a ton of investment in infrastructure. Not only do you have all the dealer banks and other direct participants, there are monetary utilities like CHIPS and CLS, and financial utilities like Intercontinental Exchange or ICE, and the CME and a whole bunch of others which integrate all the financial markets, Euroclear, for example. It takes a lot of time and effort to be able to make money as mobile as the modern world needs it to be, at least given the limitations of the 20th century. This bank-centered arrangement was a necessary contributor to get it all started and make it all work, but nowadays we have different ways of keeping track of ledger money transactions. With blockchain technology, we have to ask, Do we really need to integrate millions upon millions of individual ledgers when in theory we could all use the same one? But that's a topic for a future Make It Make Sense video. And the thing was, it all worked really well, apart from maybe working too well in the 1970s, that whole great inflation thing, which is also a topic for a future video. But it worked really well, unparalleled prosperity, except for the few periods that it didn't, such as 1998. And in 1998, it brought us right back to where we were before, with the Japanese having to sell US government assets in order to raise funds because the Eurodollar market circulation wasn't redistributing, recirculating funds in a sufficient way to Tokyo and its banks. What was then known as the Asian financial crisis, really not a financial crisis, it's a dollar shortage, was nothing more than a deflationary outbreak when money didn't circulate through the Eurodollar networks in the same way it had. In May of 1998, again back to the FOMC, they discussed the implications of this Eurodollar shortage as it related to the growing crisis and Japan's role in all of it. Mr. Fisher, who's Pete Fisher, the head of the open market desk at the time, he said, just before Christmas 1997, we confronted an order from the Japanese authorities to sell in treasury bills. In the absence of, and this part is redacted. I've never seen anything redacted in any FOMC transcript before except for this. So we don't really know how much they did. What it says is we took blank amount of bills into the SOME account, selecting bills that we would be able to run off in the course of January so as not to make our need to drain reserves any worse at the end of the month. And we sold blank, we don't know how much, for them in the market and took another blank out of the repo pool where we've had elevated cash balance for them to help them in effect to meet their cash needs. In other words, confronted with the dollar shortage, the Japanese did in 1998 what they did in 1963 and would do again in 2008 as well as 2010 and other points around later history. In fact, more recently, last summer, the carry trade breakdown, what did the Japanese do? They sold tons of government bonds. It has nothing to do with politics. It has everything to do with the operation of the Eurodollar ledger money system, the reserve currency. And the reserve currency system needs to flow. It needs to make money mobile, to move it from here to here as seamlessly and as efficiently as possible to keep this modern globalized world running at the pace we need it to. And that's the problem, because ever since August of 2007, the ability of the Eurodollar system to do that has been heavily constrained by a number of things that we're going to have to talk about too. When dollars don't circulate, it leads to, among other things, drags on actual trade, because if those in Japan can't get the dollars to buy the furniture from Sweden, that's going to make trade between Sweden and Japan more difficult, if not impossible. It also leads in the financial markets to liquidating assets, not just U.S. Treasuries among governments, but in private markets, as we saw to an extent in 1997 and 1998, and to a far greater extent 2007 and 2008. In other words, deflation and all the consequences, including depression, that go along with it. When ledger money isn't circulating, that's when there's a problem. But here's the thing, though. The fact that the Eurodollar has been malfunctioning since 2007, yet 20 years, almost 20 years later, it's still here, still the centerpiece of the reserve currency arrangement, that tells you everything you need to know about the Eurodollar and the ability of anyone to actually replace it or do something about it. It's still here because it's the only thing that can perform the roles of a reserve currency. Ditching the dollar would be hugely complicated. And that's what most dollar doomers, they just don't get. They make it sound like countries just decide one day to use some other currency. That's largely because dollar doomers have no idea what a reserve currency is and what it really needs to do. In the end, you wouldn't be replacing the dollar, a political creation. You would have to be creating an alternative to the Eurodollar and therefore connecting the entire world under a common medium. Even countries that might want to shift from the Eurodollar, they are severely limited in how much they can by this lack of alternative. And for anyone who might want to replace the Eurodollar, it's not such an easy task under our current capabilities. Even blockchain, which will eventually do it, there's still an enormous amount of work to be done. And until that happens in the more distant future, we're left with what there is. And when the current Eurodollar malfunctions more, which it will, like in April of 2025, we'll see foreigners selling their treasuries, and everybody will be in the media telling us about how foreigners are ditching the dollar and they're ditching US government assets. And none of that will be true. It's not because they hate America or it's anything political. It has nothing whatsoever to do with inflation or the Fed, except as an indirect acknowledgement, the Fed is not a central bank. They sell treasuries because that's what the Eurodollar demands, regardless of Jay Powell or anyone else. A reserve currency is an essential component of everything in your life, whether you ever knew it or not. Therefore, it is critical to understand what it needs to do, move ledger money, and whether it is doing so sufficiently. And that's what Eurodollar University is here for, to fill in all of these gaps left behind by economics that either takes no interest in these topics because it doesn't believe they're important, or if it does, gets them all wrong. And then the plethora of social media and mainstream media and just out there theories that have rushed into the vacuum left behind by economics. Eurodollar University, we understand what reserve currency is, and we have the tools available to help you navigate all of these difficulties, these challenges, to get at some facts, evidence, and hopefully some truth. So check out Eurodollar University, our subscriptions and memberships that help you along in filling in all these gaps. Reserve currency, one of the most vital and important topics that we have, and nobody knows what they're talking about. And of course, check back here to our YouTube page for more of these Make It Make Sense videos. We've got 2 other ones so far. The stock market and its connection to the Great Depression or lack of connection to the Great Depression, as well as why the Federal Reserve targets interest rates. They target interest rates because the Eurodollar forced them to. So thank you for joining me. Hope to see you again.